Hi, my name is Lindsay. I am a rising senior in the IB program, and I've decided to make this my CAS project. I'm going to be telling y'all how to garden and otherwise maintain your lawn in a way that helps protect the bees, and by extension, other pollinators, but the tips I'm going to talk about are focused on bees in particular. So I'll get us started with a fun fact. There are 40 different species of bumblebees in Canada, and bumblebees are different from other native bee species because they live in the ground in colonies. And they're different from honeybees because they can forage in bad weather. And I'd also like to say that if you see me looking off to the side, it's because I have my notes here because I don't want to be trying to memorize it because then I might end up making stuff up, and I want to make sure all this information is as accurate as possible. So let's get started with the actual tips. I would like to say that the thing that actually sparked my interest in all of this is that I was at a walk at the Fletcher Wildlife Garden, which is near the Experimental Farm. If you live in Ottawa, that's a really cool place to visit. And I saw on one of the little trails off to the side that they had this little section that had a little sign that said B&B, but it was spelled B-E-E and B-E-E, so it was, a fun play on words. And it was basically this thing that they provide you with some guidelines on how to plant to protect bees, or I guess more to support existing bee colonies. And they send you this sign so that you can kind of advertise that. And so when I got home, I looked it up, and that's how I came up with the idea for this project, and that's how I found the vast majority of this information. I did also end up emailing a whole bunch of other pollination protection, bumblebee protection groups, and got some other resources that way. But yeah, so B&B is where a lot of this information comes from, and the PDF that I initially found when I looked them up will be linked in the description of this video, and it has some additional, more technical information like a list of flowers and a list of which ones are best for which climates, etc. So once you've listened to me tell you all the basic points, you can look at that for more specific advice. And I will be linking other PDFs and things like that I referenced, that some of them are very, very detailed and will give you literally a list of all the species of plants that are good ideas to get, but I'm just going to go over the basic principles because you don't need to know exactly what species. It's more about color and whether or not they're native. So, food plants for bees need to provide nectar and pollen throughout the growing season. So you don't want to get a whole bunch of flowers that bloom around the same time, because then they're only going to have that nectar during, let's say, August. So the idea is that you should have at least 3 types of flowers in bloom at any given time. So get maybe 3 spring blooming flowers, 3 that bloom in the summer, 3 that bloom like late summer, early fall. So when you go to a flower store, generally they tell you that on like the little tab thing that's in the soil when you buy plants. Also, there's just chances are when you move into a house, whoever lived there before probably planted some perennials. So you can just pay attention and see when the ones that you have already bloom. I feel like a lot of perennials bloom pretty early, but that could be just random anecdotal evidence and not actually true at all across the board. So just make sure that you're paying attention to what you already have, and then you can grab some annuals or plant new perennials to fill in those gaps. There's also the fun trick that if you have trees on your property, some of those, the flowering trees, often are really early blooming. So that is super helpful to know, especially if your trees and your garden are relatively close together, so everything's kind of in one place. Because as we'll talk about a little later, your garden can be a very good place for bees to overwinter, so you want the tree to also be pretty close to that. But if it's not, it's not. There's also the additional thing of when you're planting flowers, obviously if they're perennials and they're already there, you can't move them, but when you're planting flowers, try to keep clumps of the same flower together. You might be tempted to kind of distribute them, but bees are better at finding flowers when it's like a clear patch of them versus when it's kind of hidden between other flowers. So plant your flowers in clumps together, like with like. And if for aesthetic purposes, you might want to clump them, but don't clump all of the same blooming time together so that it doesn't look lopsided in your garden. If you don't care about aesthetics, that doesn't really matter. It's not going to matter to the bees, but for aesthetic purposes, you can separate them that way. Just try to keep the same flower in clumps. Also, make sure that the plants you buy don't use pesticides, especially a class of chemicals called neonicotinoids. And that particular chemical is really dangerous for bees, but all pesticides, seeing as bees are insects and that's what pesticides are meant to kill, are not going to be great for them. So the Friends of the Earth website has a list of plant companies that are committed to not using neonicotinoids, and that list can be found in the description of this video alongside those other PDFs I mentioned, and I will be making it clear in the description what is for what, so do not worry about that. But anywho, if plants are a problem for your garden, there are other more eco-friendly ways to prevent them. If your soil food web is very healthy, it's got all the right microbes and things going on, they'll take care of pests for you. So if you focus more on gardening in a way that supports natural soil life, pesticides won't be needed anyway. Anywho, choose native plants. I mentioned that briefly earlier, but the biggest thing with plants is that they're native, because A, you don't want to accidentally introduce an invasive species, and B, they're evolved to live here, which means that they're going to be easier to maintain. You're not going to need to water them because they're used to this climate. Well, I guess with climate change, it's going to change, but they'll be easier to take care of than other non-native plants. And native plants have evolved alongside the bees that live here. So they're actually going to give the bees the best nutrients possible, and the bees know that these flowers are ones that they enjoy, if that makes sense. You should also try to source your seeds from local growers. That's just a good way to support the farmers around you. But, the bees don't know where you got the seeds, so that's fine. Just make sure you pick plants that are native and that are non-invasive. And there is a PDF in one of the documents that I am going to be putting in the description that will give you some tips for that. Also, this is general gardening advice. Consider the site conditions when you're planting. Don't buy a full sun plant and put it directly under a tree. And then another little tip about flowers, and I believe this is my last thing about flowers, is choose different colors, shapes, and heights. Colors, try to pick white, yellow, purple, and blue. That's what the bees like best. And then still vary them. Don't only get white flowers, for example, but try to stay within white, yellow, blue, purple. Different species of bees like different shapes of flower because of the difference in their tongue lengths. So try to get different shapes of flowers. Some have kind of long, tubes almost at the base of their petals. Some don't. Some are very open, so, shake it up. And different plants attract different species. So just get a mix. And then, as I mentioned, flowering trees and shrubs are always a good bet, especially since they bloom early. Now, off of flowers, but still in what you're planting, add a native bush grass or sedge, because those are really great nesting and overwintering sites for bees, as I briefly mentioned. You want something short and clump forming, not the large spreading ones that you might plant across your lawn, because they need something that they can kind of hide in over winter. And also that just adds a little bit of variety to your garden, so it'll look nicer too. And so I do have a document in the description of this video that will provide more technical details about planting and maintaining a garden, all that jazz. I might actually make a video about that down the line. And then there will also be a nice PDF of technical information from Pollinators Canada and a downloadable planting guide for different regions in Canada from the same place. And if you're not in Canada, it's super easy to find that sort of stuff. Literally just search up native plants wherever you live and you'll get a list. And then just skim through, try to find a variety of different blooming periods, different heights, different shapes, and staying within white, yellow, blue, purple. It's not the end of the world if they're not that color. That's just the best options. And yeah, you should be able to find stuff no problem. Now, totally aside from what you're planting, shelter and water. We need them. Bees also need them. So bees need dry cavities to nest in. So for example, they can use cavities in trees, or they can hide out under loose leaves or rocks. And so the best way to do this, in addition to like bunch grasses, like I mentioned, is to just, when you rake in the fall, just rake it into a pile in the corner instead of totally removing all the leaves, because that pile of leaves will be a really great place for the bees to overwinter. A really great idea is to make sure that that kind of coordinates with where your early bloom plants are, and also make sure that that is out of the way. You do not need your children or pets, or just you when you forget that they're there, like walking through that pile, because A, you might kill the poor little bees that you're trying to protect in the first place, and B, you might get stung, or your pets or whatever might get stung. So don't do that. Try to make sure it's out of the way, and ideally near your early bloom stuff so they can be free in the spring and get food. You may not like the idea of leaving leaves there because it's like unseemly, or find something else to do as a bee hideout, but that is why those signs exist. The ones that I initially saw that prompted me to look this up, they do have signs that kind of say this is a B&B garden or whatever, so that it's clear kind of why your garden looks different, why your lawn looks different, and then you can like kind of advertise the idea to your neighbors. And the Pollinator Habitat website also has some signs, so I'm going to link both of those sign options in the description. You can pick what you like. I think only the B&B ones are particular about like, that's why my lawn looks different than yours. So that's basically all of my tips. I will just say, make sure that you also have a little bit of bare ground somewhere, or where there's only a little bit of leaf litter, because the queen actually will bury herself to sleep over the winter. And then for water, you can have a little small dish with those pebble things that you can put in aquariums in it so that the bees don't drown trying to drink. And you're going to want to refill and rinse that often so that you don't get mosquito larvae and other unfortunate guests. You don't really have to do that, but that's a little bonus thing you can do. So that is everything. If you have questions, you can leave them in the comments. If you have other tips, also leave those in the comments. Check the description for all of those lists of like flowers, tips, particular gardening advice, those signs, all that good stuff. And that is all. And keep your eyes peeled, because I may be posting an additional video about more technical like gardening tips. And I'm also planning to do a little part 2 to this, also part of my cast project, that will talk a bit more about non-gardening ways to protect the bees. So stuff like activism and like large scale protect the pollinators. So yeah, that's all for me.